Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the International Relations Council's Beyond the Headlines series, where we go beyond day-to-day news cycles to explore the people, experiences, and ideas shaping global affairs. My name is Kerav Agarwal, and today I'm honored to be joined by Frank Lavin, former U.S. Ambassador to Singapore, former White House political director under President Ronald Reagan, and former Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Over the course of his career, Ambassador Lavin has worked across diplomacy, trade policy, national security, and international business, with extensive experience focused on Asia and global affairs. He also recently authored Inside the Reagan White House, reflecting on presidential leadership and his time serving during a pivotal moment in American politics and foreign policy. Mr. Lavin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Krav, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to chat. I had a great visit to Kansas City, and I love these conversations.
Of course, you've worked across diplomacy, trade, policy, business, and multiple presidential administrations. Looking back, what first drew you towards public service and international affairs?
Well, I think it's the consequential nature of what government policies do. How do we allow an economy to perform as effectively as possible? How do we get that economic growth that creates jobs and allows for progress and creates affluence? How do we do that? What kind of programs need to be in place to allow that? And internationally, what about stability and peace? How do we work through an international structure so that no nation feels incentivized to use violence or use force, and all nations can advance toward a goal of a better life on a basis of collaboration?
For sure. And was there like a certain spark or certain person that you met when you were young that first drew you to those areas that you've worked so hard on? Or was
Well,
there a
I
certain
think
moment?
I sort of came to political maturity in the 1970s, and I think the driving themes of that decade were Cold War related, and the Soviet Union on the back of the American withdrawal and eventual collapse in Vietnam. On the back of that, the Soviet Union took on a very aggressive international pose and expansionary kind of approach. And my view was the U.S. wasn't rising to the challenge. That we needed to be very careful about what the Soviet Union was doing. It was a threat to the United States, and we needed to have some kind of political leadership that could push back against that. So that was some of the formative ways I looked at the world in the 1970s.
Yeah. So you've spent years working in the Reagan White House during
Mm.
such a pivotal period in American politics and foreign policy. Beyond the public image people saw, what was President Reagan actually like day to day as a leader and as a person behind the scenes? What was he like as a person to work with, and how was he?
I think first and foremost, he's a very genial guy. If you showed him something, he would read it and comment on it. So he was never sort of arrogant or diffident. And in fact, I can tell you, Karav, because the president would be buttonholed on his way to a meeting in the White House, or he'd be walking down a corridor and people would stop and say, "Hey, Mr. President, would you look at this?" Or "Let me ask you a question." The administrative office had to send out a directive to White House staff, an internal memo to White House staff saying, "Please do not stop the president when he's on his way to a meeting and ask him a question, because he'll stop and he'll try to respond to the question, and all you're doing is slowing him down." So I thought that was a very fair response, but it does reflect that Reagan is fundamentally a genial guy, and he does try to respond to human needs, and that made him a very pleasant person to work with.
Yeah, and over the course of his presidency, you also helped organize the Reagan-Gorbachev Reykjavik summit, which became such an important moment in Cold War diplomacy, like you mentioned earlier. What did experiences like that teach you about how leaders and foreign heads of states navigate high-stakes international tensions?
Well, and let me say something that compliments Gorbachev as well. I don't think either of these two leaders had personal animosity toward their counterpart, and I think both of them would have said that is a sort of juvenile. If you're trying to advance your country's interest as you perceive it, you've got to connect with somebody on the other side of the table. Let's try to understand that person's point of view, and let's try to make some kind of case for what you believe based on the merits of the case. So you're treating the other person with respect. It's not denigrating the person or insulting the person or raising your voice to get you ahead, but you're trying to shape some kind of outcome that allows the other person to feel he's better off with this new outcome as well as you're better off. In other words, that win-win scenario. So I think Gorbachev, in many ways, had that, and I think was very much part of Reagan's approach to foreign policy as well. That the United States, we have no territorial ambition. We're not trying to take or claim or expand anybody's territory. We're trying to create international approaches in which anybody can participate. So we set up the International Civil Aviation Administration that allows commercial air flights around the world. We set up and participate in the International Telecommunication Union. We did not set it up, but that allows email to be free and globally used. So the point is, if you have the right kind of international architecture, anybody can benefit, and it doesn't hurt anybody else if you do participate. So that was a very important building block to U.S. foreign policy. And let's work first and foremost with the industrialized democracies that share our view of individual freedom and private markets and collaboration on defense issues so that we have a group of friends we can work with.
Yeah, you mentioned President Reagan was a very genial guy. He would answer all your questions. Was there any specific anecdote or special memory you had of you and the president together?
Well, we spent a lot of time together. Actually, one element of my meeting, I was at Camp David when he hosted Margaret Thatcher at Camp David, and so this wasn't his relationship with me, but it was a relationship with Margaret Thatcher. What was really astonishing to me as a young person who spent a fair amount of time with the president was the extraordinary familiarity that Margaret Thatcher enjoyed with Ronald Reagan. And I did not see this with any other leader, but she would begin a conversation by saying, "Now, Ronnie, here's what you need to do." And when I first heard that, I almost thought that was a borderline rude or presumptuous that you're referring to the president by his first name. But he was all smiles. He had a first name. It was a Maggie Ronnie relationship, like old high school friends. And he enjoyed that familiarity, and he enjoyed her being a little bit forward and being a little bit pedantic and saying, "Here's what you need to do." So it was a very positive relationship, and there was an enormous amount of respect between the two of them.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And like you mentioned about Gorbachev, there was sort of a personal respect for each of the leaders. And I think that's what defined President Reagan as a statesman and as a president of the late 20th century. Kind of shifting the conversation, a lot of my own interests focus on how economics, trade, and industrial capacity shape geopolitical power. Over the
Sure.
course of your career, how have you seen trade and economic policy become increasingly tied to national security?
Yeah, we came out of World War II looking at this kind of Cold War dynamic and realizing we needed some type of international architecture to allow for trade and allow for liberalization. And it began with the GATT in I think 49, and that changed the GATT change to the World Trade Organization, but at least it's a mechanism in which everybody can participate. And it requires, for example, Grab, it requires every country to post their tariff regulations that if you each country is free to set its own tariff rates, but they must be posted and they must be applied equally. So it provides for transparency and predictability in international trade. And on top of that, the United States, as most countries, undertook incremental liberalization to say if we can move toward freer trade step by step basis, so we're not causing a lot of domestic dislocation, domestic pain, but we're allowing Americans to benefit from global advances, we're going to have a prosperous nation. And indeed, that's what unfolded over the sort of 80 years. Now, the current administration has a very different view that sometimes trade is deleterious, so we have to push back against trade. That's a bit of an outlier view, I have to say. It's really inconsistent with about 80 years of progress we've made in trade. My view is uh, people ask you what makes America work or what makes American economy so successful, and there are many answers to that. But one answer is America is the best place in the world to have an idea, to take an idea, bring an idea. And Americans don't mind competition. Americans don't mind using other people's ideas, and we can improve somebody else's ideas or compete against the idea or harness the idea or adapt the idea. But then you say any idea in the world can find a home, arguably, in the United States. The market ultimately is the test. Consumer receptivity, the idea is the ultimate test of the idea. But if you have that approach, then every idea in the world comes to your market and everything you do is improved that much better. So, no surprise, America is the world leader in so many industry segments because we have such an open economy. And I would say one that is not thin-skinned or insular or defensive about an idea that might have originated in another country.
Thank you for that. And I think you've perfectly summed it up, especially for a lot of people in this day and age. There's so much misinformation, and there's not necessarily a clear thought about how economics and trade policy works. So thank you for providing a history of how it's worked over the last 80 years. You spent a large part of your career focused on Asia, including serving as the US ambassador to Singapore. From your perspective, why is the Indo-Pacific and that entire region become such a central region in global politics and strategy?
Yeah, I would say it's fundamentally China, and over time it'll be China and India, meaning China is the largest country in the world that is still defining its foreign policy and its international role. And its economic growth has outpaced the rest of the world for decades now. And typically, if we look back through human history, no surprise that once an economy starts that kind of long-term economic ascendancy, it also can challenge the international system. It wants more from the international system. And they think to some extent, well, we've cracked the code. We have a better model or a better system than the Europeans or the Americans or Japan. And so we can put a little more pressure on the international system and demand more from it. Now, how true that is a separate point, but it's no surprise that it becomes a guidepost inside the leadership of that policy. So I think we look through every empire in history, went through that point of enjoying outpaced economic activity, and that translates into increased political reach and increased military power and increased demands on the international system. So it can be a challenge for the US and US allies to have China act in that fashion.
Yeah, continuing on that, today conversations about China often center around supply chains, technology, tariffs, and economic competition rather than just a pure military rivalry.
Sure.
Do you think that we're entering a fundamentally new era of geopolitical competition and kind of a Cold War 2.0 scenario between the United States and China?
Well, I think there are going to be elements of China's international role that might mimic or mirror the Soviet Union international role, but I don't think you can take that analogy very far. For one, the China has a very successful domestic economy, and that domestic economy has all sorts of international linkages, meaning that both empowers China, to my mind, it gives them prosperity that they can do things, but it also, I think, on some level, constrains China to say, look, you've got a big middle class now. You have a very successful industry. Be careful about lighting fires because you're putting your whole society at risk. So I think we see China moving more incrementally, more opportunistically. They're still willing to challenge the status quo, but I don't think they're as reckless or as opportunistic as the Soviet Union was.
Thank you for that. You've worked in government, banking, consulting, and international business, kind of again
Mm.
transitioning. How did moving between public and private sectors change the way you understood global affairs and policymaking?
Well, yeah, it's an adjustment. I mean, businesses are here for sort of defined specific purposes. They're providing a product or service, and they only prosper insofar as the market likes their product or service. So they have to find somebody who loves them, and they have to provide some economic use to the broader community. If they can do that, they can prosper and they can grow. But the point is, the business is not there for any kind of broader aims than I just described. It flourishes in stable economic times. It flourishes where the political system respects market economics. It flourishes when there's international stability, but it can't really do much to shape or create those outcomes. So it's really up to, I think, the political leadership to put the environment in place, put the policy in place that allows prosperity to take place. And boy, oh boy, you'll get prosperity. I think that 80 years since the end of World War II is the greatest advancement in global prosperity the world's ever seen.
Right.
Hundreds of millions of people pulled out of poverty, nations transformed, and there's been just a lot of good news because of market economics and because of international liberalization.
Yeah, in recent years, the world has become more focused on supply chain resilience and economic security. What vulnerabilities do you think the United States has become more aware of after the pandemic and after 2020 and growing
Right.
tensions with China and other countries?
Well, Karav, I think you make an excellent point because one of the challenges embedded in market economics is this hunt for efficiencies. We're always looking to improve what we're doing by 1% or a tenth of a percent. And that's fine. And if you can improve it, then you can either lower your prices or you earn greater profits or, there's good news in there with every efficiency. But there's a risk in that hunt for efficiency, which is that concentration risk. If you're saying there's one factory in the world that produces an input better than anybody else, well, of course, that's where you want to source that input. But the trouble with that one factory in the world then is what's called concentration risk. If there's a disruption, could be a natural disaster, it could be political tension. Well, then you're at risk for that. So we would tell anybody, suggest anybody, you have to balance between that ultimate goal of efficiency and concentration risk. So you want some kind of diversity in your supply chain so you're not 100% locked into any one market. I think Nike determined in the year 2000, in the decade of 2000s, that it did not want to source more than 50% of its inputs from any one country for this set of reasons. So they were willing to say, look, we know some markets might produce some elements of a shoe at a more expensive base than somebody else, but we are avoiding concentration risk. We're going to have an insurance policy, if you will, by having multiple suppliers and a more diverse supply chain. But so I think the international suppliers really need to think about that because you do put yourself at risk if you only have one friend that is supplying an input. Yeah, I would tell anybody think about having multiple friends in multiple markets.
And how do you see supply chain diversification in the United States go over the next 10, 20 years or for the next foreseeable future?
Well, I think the long-term benefits of international liberalization, I think, are broadly accepted. So I think that's the ultimate goal of all economies, all societies, is to move toward market economics and respect the international marketplace. However, however, it can bring with it cost or risk or exposure. One of which is, as I said, is concentration risk, but one of which there might be dual use technology or a security dimension of what you're buying or selling. And we wouldn't want to inadvertently empower somebody that might be a geopolitical rival or military adversary. We wouldn't want to inadvertently grow a dependency on that kind of relationship. So you have other considerations beyond pure market efficiencies, depending on what segment you're in and how tech oriented your product is. But the long-term trend, I think, is toward liberalization and internationalization of that supply chain. And then there's some important asterisks, if I may say it that way,
Yeah,
on that long-term trend.
for sure. Now, moving back to your time with President Reagan, you recently wrote Inside the Reagan White House, which came out reflecting on presidential leadership. In your view, what separates effective leadership from ineffective leadership during periods of uncertainty and global tension? And how do you see lessons from your book play out?
That's good. And by the way, I think I moved my head out of the way, but that's
Yeah,
the book right there. There's the
right.
Jack, the
Yes.
book Inside the Reagan White House. Look, I would say there are twin pillars for leadership. One is to articulate the vision. Where do you want to go? Where do you want the country to go? Where do you want to be? And I would say this to any president: you're in for 4 years, maybe 8 years. Let's say it's 4 years, and you and I are having lunch after you've left office. And I ask you, did you do a good job? Did it work out? And you say, yeah, I really feel good. What has to take place those 4 years that allow you to say that? What is your vision? What constitutes success? So, meaning it's not a clerical job, it's not an administrative job, it's not, well, I answered all the emails effectively, I lit the Christmas tree, we had a good Easter egg hunt, I did all of the ceremonial roles. That's great. You ought to do that. But where are you trying to take the country, and what is the next equilibrium point for our society and our economy, and how do we get there? So articulating that vision and having that vision is one of the two big pillars of leadership. The second one is you have to create a consensus for action. You have to take people with you. It's a democratic system. it's an open society. It's a communications era. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got something to say, a comment, a question. Fair enough. So you have to, so to speak, sell your vision. You have to build that consensus about why, if you go down this path, why will America be better off if we go down this path? And allow that consensus to be built around your ideas and your vision. So those, to my mind, are the two important elements of leadership. If you want to be a successful president, you need both of those pillars.
For sure. Finally, as a last question in today's interview, for students who are interested in diplomacy, public service, international relations, or security, but are still figuring out their specific path, what advice would you give them as they prepare for a rapidly changing world?
Yeah, well, first, I'm delighted to hear the question because look, our country is going to face challenges, domestic challenges, economic growth, the use of tech, and international challenges, right? It's never a quiet moment. So, to the next generation needs to step up, and I welcome that. I would say there's two baskets you need to think about if you're looking at possible government or policy work. One basket has to do with performance. Performance counts, excellence counts. Your ability to hit the ball increases your ability to get signed up for the team, right? So you have to be able to go to batting practice and hit the ball. And then the manager says you're on the roster, right? So one is just performance. And that seems like GPA, student leadership, summer internships, et cetera, that tell the person at the other side of the table, I'm serious about this vocation. I'm serious about trying to understand these issues. So that's great. That's the performance part. The other part you need is a little harder, I think, to get, but also very important, and that is visibility or familiarity in the system. That you need decision makers to at least have some frame of reference for who you are or your work or your writing or your professional contribution, meaning it's not just GPA. You send a note in saying I've got a 3.9, that's great, but they're going to take the 3.9 who they know or they've met or they've worked with, or they might even take the 3.8 who they know or they met they worked with, because that familiarity and that working relationship brings in all of these soft skills like dependability and reliability and congeniality, and those are variables. But if you see, if this person was our summer intern, this person was a pretty good kid, this person did a good job, and we're going to give him the staff job even if he might not even be 3.8, but we like him and we know he's a very dependable person. And that's going to beat out the person they never met who's got the 3.9. So look for a way to attain some level of familiarity or visibility in the system. That means the summer internships on the Hill or at a policy institute, or do some serious writing, work at a think tank, or make policy contributions, be active on campus in the various committees, or contribute to the campus publications. But you at least have some kind of track record where people are in your space or experts in your field can say, hey, that wasn't a bad deal. You made an interesting point in your paper back there. So I'd say view life is a job interview. How you perform and who you connect with will help you along the way, and just look for opportunities to get that visibility and that familiarity in the system.
Well, thank you so much for that response and all your answers throughout this interview. I've certainly learned a lot from your experiences and your words of advice, and hopefully all our viewers do the same. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Good to chat with you.